For a long time, the only available tools for creating CSS layouts were features like floats and positioning. However, some layout designs were difficult to achieve with these tools, like vertically centering a block of content inside of its parent, or making all the children of a container take up an equal amount of the space available, like width or height, or making all the columns adopt the same height even if they contain different amounts of content. And as you will see in this video, Flexbox makes a lot of these layout tasks much easier. If we imagine you have a container like a div with some elements inside of it, to activate Flexbox, all you need to do is to set display to flex on the container. And with that, you just created two invisible axes. The main axis is where your elements will align themselves. You can think of this as horizontal rows by default. And the cross axis is the secondary direction, which is at 90 degrees to the main axis. You can think of this as vertical columns by default. And with this property, we aligned our elements horizontally, but in case you want to align them vertically, you can set the flex direction property to the column, and this will align your items below each other instead of aligning them horizontally. And if you want to align them back horizontally, you can set the flex direction to row, and this is the default property, so even if we get rid of this, you still have the same layout. You can also reverse the order of this. For example, instead of row, you can set row reverse. And in this case, items will flow horizontally from right to left instead of left to right. So you can see we have 1 on the right side and 3 on the left side. And similar to this, instead of using just column direction, you can set this to column reverse. In this case, we will have 1 at the bottom and 3 at the top. And that's how you can set the flex direction. Let's set this back to row. And now what if you want to align those elements on the main axis? For that, we will use justify content property. By default, this is set to flex start, and this won't change anything in our layout, but you can set this to flex end, and now items will be grouped at the end of our main axis. We can also center them by using the center property, and now it will align them to the center of the main axis. You can use space between if you want your items to spread out evenly, with the first item touching the start and the last item touching the end of your container. And similar to this, we have space around. But in this case, it will apply equal space around each item, including the edges. And you can also use space evenly. And in this case, each item will get the exact same amount of space on all sides. So that's how you can align your items on the main axis. Now, what about the cross axis? For aligning them on the cross axis, we use align items property. By default, this is set to stretch, where items stretch to fill the container on the cross axis. If we set this to flex end, now items will align to the end of the cross axis. Similarly, you can use flex starts, and in this case they will align on the start of the cross axis. If you want to vertically center your items, you can use the center property for that. And you can also set this to baseline, and in this case items will align their text baselines. The key point to understand is that justify content aligns items on the main axis, and align items will align them on the cross axis. And if you change this from row to column, now the axes have changed, and justify content will align them on the column axis, and align items will align them on the row axis. Now what if we want to set the justify content to be flex start, but we also want to apply some spacings between our items? Without using Flexbox, you can select the individual items from here and maybe apply some margin from the right side of each element and set this to 30 pixels. But there is a better way to do this, and that is with Flexbox gap property. You can set the gap property and set this to be 30 pixels. And now you can get rid of the margin right property, and your elements will still have some spacing applied between them. But the Flexbox doesn't just stop at the container level. You can also apply stylings to individual items. For example, let's say we want to select the first element from our items, and we want it to make some more space on the main axis. We can set the flex grow property and set this to 1, for example. And this controls how much an item should grow relative to others, and higher number will mean it grows more. For example, if we set the first item to take up 1 space, the second item to take 2 space, and the third item to take half space. This means that in total we have 1, 3 and 3.5 space, and this one will take 2 units, this one will take 1 unit, and this one will take half units. If we save this, you can see that the second one is the largest item, then we have the first one, and then the smallest one is the third one. Let's say we add 2 more items in our container. Now you can see that our items are shrinking to fit in this space. And to control that, you have the flex shrink property. This is the item's willingness to shrink when there is not enough space. By default, this is set to 1, which means that it will shrink proportionally if needed. If you set this to 0, this means that it refuses to shrink even if it causes an overflow in your elements. For example, you can set the first item and the last item in your div to refuse to shrink, and this means that the first and last items will not shrink no matter how small the space is in the container. And another property of individual items is flex basis. This sets the initial size of an item before extra space is distributed. You can think of this as the item's starting point. For example, you can set this to be 30%. And this will set the initial size of the first element. And you can also use auto, for example, and use the item's content size in this case. Or you can set this to content and use the content's minimum size. But there is a shorthand for this. Instead of using flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis, you can use a shorthand for that, and that is the flex property. With this, you can set 3 values to it. The first value will be the flex grow, the second one will be flex shrink, and the third one will be flex basis. For example, you can set this to be 1, 0, 0, and this means that you set flex grow to 1, flex shrink to 0, and flex basis to 0. Now what if we add more items and now your items go beyond the borders of your container? In these cases, you can use the flex wrap property and set this to wrap. And this means that whenever there is not enough space, your items will wrap onto multiple lines if needed. By default, this is set to no wrap. And the items will go beyond the borders if this is set to no wrap. And you can also set this to wrap reverse. In this case, they will still wrap into multiple lines if needed, but the order will be in reverse. And if you set the flex wrap to wrap, you now gain control over new property, which is called align content. And this lets you control the spacing of those wrapped elements. It works just like justify content, but for multiple lines. For example, you can set this to flex start to align them towards the start, or you can set this to flex end to align the items towards the end. You can use the center to align them vertically, and you have the similar properties as justify content, so you have space between, which will spread out with space between, or you have space around, and you also have stretch property. And what if you want to align one of these items differently? For example, let's say you want to align the 7th item to be flex end. In this case, you can use the align self property on individual item, and you can set this to be flex end, for example. This is basically overriding the container's align items, so all of the items in the container will be baseline, but the 7th item will override that and it will be flex end. And here you have all the similar properties that you have for align items on the container. So you can set this to be center, for example, or you can set this to be flex start and so on. And lastly, let's say I want to change the order of this. For example, I want the item number 6 to be first. I can set the order to this and I set this to -1. This will move the 6th item to the first place. And similarly, I can select the 2nd item, for example, and set the order of this to be 1. And this will move the 2nd item to the last place. So it just takes a number and lower numbers appear first and higher numbers appear last. But setting this order property affects the accessibility, and if you have some other way to achieve the result that you want, you shouldn't be using this order property that much.